talk more normally when everyone's quiet. So welcome all to the Writers' Centre. Blake Morrison needs no introduction, which I'm sure is why there's so many people here. It's really nice to see so many people. I'm going to introduce him anyway. He's earned it. So, poet, novelist, journalist, but perhaps best known, even notorious, for his memoirs. First of all, and when did you last see your father? Then things my mother never told me, and now 30 years since the first one, Two Sisters. Book's already had tremendous reviews, I know from having had a look today. The Observer said, a wonderfully heartfelt and tender thing, delicate and unstinting and clear-eyed. According to this, my proof copy, Blake writes with a reckless respect for the truth. I don't really know what that means, but I think maybe Blake will tell us what that means. And also, just published also is, which feels like a sort of an accompanying book to the memoir, book of poems, Skin and Blister, sister, also inspired by his sister. Which I haven't yet had a chance to look at because Blake only gave it to me this morning, but perhaps he'll talk a bit about that as well. In fact, he was just telling me that he's working with a band who plays his, accompanies his poems as well, so it seems like a new...
I've always wanted to be in a band.
And a new
I get there easily, I just read the words and they play.
They play their music.
A variety of instruments, yes.
So I will ask Blake some questions, he will read. There'll be plenty of time for people to ask questions, so think about that. And then there will be books for sale, there will be wine. Blake, I'm sure, will be happy to sign books. So yeah. But perhaps, Blake, you could start off by sort of setting the scene in terms of what you wanted to do with the book, why now, give us a bit of a... For people who haven't had a chance to read, or...
I mean, you missed out another... What was it in the Mail on Sunday? It called me pitiless. Pitiless! It was a nice review, it's a praising review, but I'm pitiless, apparently. Because I keep writing into my books about family, which was never the plan. But after my father died, there didn't seem to be any other subject, so I wrote something about him, and then... My mum, I never expected to write about her, but my dad had kept all these letters that they'd exchanged way before I was born, and about their courtship, and it just was an incredible sort of story. You don't see your parents at that point, before they're your parents. And then two sisters, so primarily my sister Gillian, who died, getting on for 3 years ago now. Where are we? Oh, over 3 years ago. And I perhaps hadn't expected to write about her either, but I'd always kept diary entries and that kind of thing. I might just read a bit, it might be the easiest way of telling you about the book. So, about Jill, I say, many years ago I resolved not to write about her while she was alive, or rather, not to publish anything I had written. She, Jill, had walk-on parts, like a film extra, in 2 memoirs I published about our parents. That's all it was, the odd look-in or passing mention. There was plenty to be said, but not yet. Even if she had given me carte blanche, the page would have stayed blank. You can't write an honest memoir when the subject is alive. At any rate, I can't. Death is the only permission. After those books about Mum and Dad came out, I was sometimes asked if I had another memoir in me. No, I'd reply. I write fiction these days because I've run out of family. Once or twice I answered even more facetiously. I don't know if I've another memoir in me, but my sister's quaking in her boots. There's an assumption that to write honestly about someone is an act of aggression. That's the gallery I was playing to. But I felt no aggression towards Jill, didn't then, don't now. She's gone, that's all, and though there's no retrieving her, I'd like to make sense of who she was and what she became. it wasn't just that she changed over time. She could change from day to day. Drink made it worse, but the origins went deeper. You never knew which you'd get, the kind and loving Jill or the doppelganger. Two sisters. I had another sister as well. Josie's the smaller part of the story I'm telling. A half-sister, whereas Jill was full and often full on. A baby sister, proudly held up to Jill and me as we stood at a hospital window on the day she was born, but whose relation to us was never acknowledged. A sister I didn't know was my sister till 10 years or more after my father died. Two sisters. I want to understand why their lives took the direction they did. I know there's no simple answer, that I'm writing from the limited perspective of a brother or half-brother, that my memories are fragmented and unreliable. Still, I can't not make the effort. With Jill, I can't help making it. What she went through and what her family went through, many others have gone through too. My hope is that telling her story will prompt recognition, perhaps solace too, and that means being honest. The ethics of writing about real people are problematic. Candour can seem disrespectful. But when you grow up with a lie, as my sisters did, it's important to be honest, truthful. Soft-peddling would be cowardly. And the truth isn't malicious. I'm here to commemorate them, not expose. It may be of another more selfish purpose, self-exoneration. When you're newly bereaved and the death of the person you're mourning strikes you as preventable, guilt is impossible to avoid. Why didn't you meet more, speak more, tell them you love them, assuming you did? When I turned to books to look for comfort, I found neglect there too. I hope to find an author whose writing about a sister, real or imagined, could articulate my thoughts and feelings, whose insights could help me see things I'd missed, whose words could stand in for mine. Low as I was, even the greatest book might have failed to reach me. But hadn't expected the choice to be so limited. Why did so few books explore brother-sister relationships? In particular, why did so few male authors write about their sisters? Did their sisters not matter to them? Or the relationship in general not matter enough to merit inquiry? Brothers writing about brothers, sisters writing about sisters, sisters writing about brothers. There were many examples of those, but brothers writing about sisters, very few. So yeah, I think that probably explains that the book kind of falls into two parts, or there's a second strand to it, which is looking at examples of the brother-sister relationship in history or in fiction, and then the story, the narratives, kind of held in a way almost birth to grave of two sisters, sister and half-sister.
And I'm sort of wondering whether, to me, it felt quite different to the other two books in a way. There's a really sort of, you talked about the sort of perhaps the need to self-exonerate or feel like you wanted to sort of exonerate yourself somewhere, but there's a very strong vein of kind of guilt or regret or it's a very,
beating myself up all the time.
Yeah, it's a very sad book, and I'm just wondering how the experience of writing it differed to working on books about your father, and also you're obviously in different relation to your sisters than you are to your parents.
Yeah.
I just wonder how it felt different. Maybe it didn't.
No, it did. I mean, the book about my dad was written in the 11 months after his death, and it was, really a book full of grief and loss. I was surprised by his death, and what else would I have written about in that year after his death? And then the book about my mum wasn't about losing something, it was about trying to find the person that she'd sort of hidden when she came from Ireland and married my dad and denied all sorts of things about her past, or didn't speak about it. With Jill, because increasingly she had addiction to alcohol and big problems with drinking, there was a bit of all of us thought, she might die any moment, and you could say that getting into her 60s was an achievement because a lot of alcoholics died, long before that. So there's on the one hand, this expectation that she might die early before her time, and then on the other, she'd had so many scrapes and got through them that maybe she'd survive. So it was a different kind of sense of loss, but undoubtedly, once she was gone, it triggered things, and I found I've been keeping diary entries for years, going way back, and they became part of the book, I guess.
I think it feels like it's easy to lose sight in a way of how, like the story in terms of your half sister thing, how kind of extraordinary that was in a way.
Yeah.
Of this sort of the main thrust of the book is really about Jill, but Josie, your half sister, comes into it. The fact that she was in your lives all the time, spitting image of your dad. It was never acknowledged. You wrote about it or you suggested the possibility that that your dad was her father. In the first memoir, it was always there, but the admission of it comes sort of very late in her life.
Yeah, I changed the name. I changed the parents' names. I mean, sorry, the dad who brought her up, not my dad. And she rang me up 10 years after the book about my dad came out and said, "Josie, that's me, isn't it?" She said, "I always thought your dad was my dad. Should we do a DNA test?" She was sort of made part of the family. I mean, it was extraordinary the way my sister and I were taken to see this newborn baby. That had never happened before. My mum worked as well as being a GP with my dad, worked in the local hospital, and her patients had babies. My mum often delivered them. She delivered this baby. She delivered my father's child by somebody else. That was pretty extraordinary. And I speculate in the book about how much they all knew, the four of them. Josie's parents and mine, did they discuss it? Was it ever acknowledged between them? Was it one of those lies where everybody was denying it, or did they have some sort of sensible conversation between them of, we'll never talk about this. Josie will grow up with Sam and Beatty as their child. There won't be any shame of it being another man's child. Or did no one acknowledge it? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, my dad seemed to dote on her and dote on her mum, and that was through 10 years of my childhood, I'd say. She was born 9 years after me, Josie, and but in an impertinent way, it was completely unacceptable. I did try asking my dad. I remember once we were driving in the car, and I tried saying, didn't really acknowledge anything. He said, "Power steering's very good, isn't it?"
when you were questioning him about his
Yeah, I tried. And then I tried, after his death, I tried, in the immediate aftermath of Auntie Beatty. We'd always been encouraged to call her aunt, and she was no aunt. And I said, "Well, it's been like a puzzle or a jigsaw in my, life, always wanting to know." And she wrote back, "Please leave me one piece of the jigsaw. It's mine," which shut me up. So she was denying an affair with my dad, and she was denying all the more vehemently that Josie might be my dad's child. So it was just a DNA test that Josie wanted to do that established it. It was we had to go to our respective GPs at different ends of the country, and you take a little sample out of the mouth. I remember seeing Saddam Hussein happened to him, didn't it? And it went off to Bart's hospital for analysis, and they wrote back eventually, in delayed time, saying, "Well, it's 5 times more likely than not you're related, but we need to do a few more tests." And then it came back 15 times more likely than not that we were related, and that's a pretty high percentage. So she's part of the story too. I guess the thing that came up a lot, which anybody who's involved in life writing, or frankly even in poetry and fiction, is consent, is writing about real people. I mean, living people are affected by these books too. And just as I'd shown the book about my dad in draft and my mum, to ask for her comments. I felt I had to show this one to my sister's kids, who've grown up, but still. And they read it and they showed relevant bits to their dad, and they had a couple of tiny things to add or change, but they gave their permission. I mean, I don't think I could have published a book about my dad, you see, if my mum had really upset my mum. And she may have hidden the degrees which she was upset, but she gave me her permission.
And similarly with your sister's kids, if they had expressed unease, would you not have published? I mean, you mentioned at the end, you say, I'm writing this even though I know it may upset them. That was a sort of...
Yeah, I mean, you've got a proof copy, which doesn't have the acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, I say very clearly that I showed it to them, and they said, well, it's the truth, so fine. But yeah, I mean, not everybody's the same, but, you know, I don't feel I have any scores to settle with people from childhood. It's not a vindictive memoir. I had, you know, a good childhood as far as I'm concerned. My parents looked after me. So there's no vindictiveness in there, and but still, you know, there are living people who are affected, and I've become really, I guess, over the years more conscious of that. And you know, people knowing about life writing, PhDs and so on will know that there's a whole issue around consent, and we have an ethics committee and so on, and I guess I've been made to think about it more. I mean, in the book about my dad, I used a letter that Auntie Beattie had written to me. I suppose I shouldn't have done. It's, you know, if the letter remains the copyright of the owner, and I didn't ask her permission, I changed her name, and so on, but I used it. Is that bad? Maybe.
Aside from the legality copyright questions, do you feel like your attitude to it has sort of evolved in terms of...
I think I'm exemplary now.
That's what I was going to suggest.
But no, I think it has evolved, or I'm much more conscious of the issues around the rights of people that are written about as opposed to the rights of the writer. You know, there's freedom of expression on the one hand, and there's a right to privacy on the other, and in this area of life writing, it's a real tangle.
Yeah. And did you feel like, well, you do sort of wrestle with it a little bit in, you know, on the page here. I mean, you know, I agree in there's no vindictiveness there. It's very tender. Much of it, I was thinking of the relationship between, or the friendship between Beattie and your mother that developed after, that was always there, but in terms of their closeness after your father died, which is really sort of, you know, powerful. They, you know, in a sense, they shared him to a degree. You know, extraordinary that your mother delivered the daughter of husband's mistress. I mean, but still, in terms of...
I mean, if you were writing about that in a novel, you'd think, oh, this is a bit implausible, isn't it?
Yeah, a bit melodrama.
But there you are. That's one of the virtues of life writing, maybe. You have to, you know, deal with real surprising stuff.
But were there still questions in terms of you talk a bit about the question of your sister's dignity and what you should show. Because you describe right at the beginning. I think it opens with a scene with you and your sister, and your sister's drunk.
Very drunk in the morning.
And you talk about, should I just let that stand for all the other times, and then you say, and your answer is sort of no, because the truth is important, sort of thing. But I'm just wondering, was there a sort of a back and forth about show this but not this, or was it sort of your reckless sort of dedication to the truth?
Pitiless,
sort of pitiless.
My oversharing. No, there was back and forth. There's a chapter of diary entries, which are mostly about her being pissed, and you know, some of the difficulties caused to my parents by that. And I did wonder about including that, and I thought if, you know, the publishers are uncertain, or people reading it and taking an early view of the book said, oh, that's a bad idea including that, I would leave it out, but in the end I left it in. You know, my line in the book is, she didn't have much dignity when she was drunk, and you know, it would be a lie to pretend about that or to omit that stuff if it's a truth-telling memoir, and if it was such a big part of her life, which it was, for her kids, for her ex. The whole story about the ex is also amazing, because she married, had two children by this guy, but she increasingly was disaffected with him, and I mean, he had to rescue her many times when she was in dire situations through drink. So in the end they had a divorce, and in the settlement of the house which she kept, she had to give him some money, and he used at least a large part of this money to buy himself a camper van, and he parked the camper van in a drive outside the house. And then, because our eyesight was becoming an increasing factor, and that's another problem or another part of the book, he tied this blue rope from the door of his camper van to her front door, so that she could feel her way along the rope to go into his camper van. I mean, a completely bizarre sort of relationship where they were sort of almost closer then than when they'd been married. And when she moved, after 60 years or whatever from the little village that she'd been living into elsewhere, well, of course, he moved there too and rented a place nearby, and then parked his camper van nearby as well. So.
And he was still looking after her until the end. I mean,
he was still looking after her, and latterly he was living back with her because he'd had an operation. And so you kind of feel these complicated, dysfunctional, ordinary relationships are worth writing about, and that maybe life writing is, in my case, was the way to do it. You know, you grow up thinking this is a very boring, dull family I live in. I can't wait to get away from it. And then it ends up somehow seeming less and less ordinary, and to your surprise, you write about it.
Yeah.
Because especially if you think, as I did, books were my escape. You know, this is a way of leaving my family. I read lots of books, and they didn't do much reading, and write things, and bye family, and then family just invade your books and take over.
Well, and not just one book in a sense, the poems as well. You say a bit about how, you know, did that happen in the same kind of space of grieving about your sister, and it was a different way to work through some of the same things, or?
Yeah, I don't know what happened really. I'm trying to look.
There's this nice picture on the back, which is of Blake sort of appearing to hold his sister up, but it's just a sort of one of those perspective trick things. But that's described in this book, isn't it? That picture.
Yes, but my dad was very into sort of trick photographs. So she's posing as if I'm holding her in my hand, which of course, in writing the book, I am, aren't I?
I see what you're doing
there. I thought I'd finished the memoir, and I thought I'd said everything I wanted to say, and then in the summer, 2 years after she died, I started writing these poems, to my surprise. Quite formal, mostly 20 sonnets, which were quite a lot of them were addressed to her. It was like trying to have a conversation with her, a conversation you might have had or should have had in life, and you never did, and trying to get her to talk, because she was very bad at talking about the stuff that was closest to her. She hated the idea of therapy. She hated the idea of sharing problems. If she'd got drunk and was sober again, that hadn't happened and wasn't to be acknowledged. And this was a way of trying to have a discussion with her, some dialogue with her. I could read one of these, which is not a sonnet, but a sestina, which is, the poets in the audience will know, maybe all of you will know. It's this very complicated verse form where you have 6 key words, which are in this case sister, blind, tense, past, drink, of course, and her. And you have 6 stanzas, and the last word of each of the 6 lines in the 6 stanzas is a repeat of these words.
This kind of audience knows this stuff.
Sorry. I'm being very boring.
They're knocking out Cistercians all the time.
Yeah, of course they are. Right, so here it is. Death dropped its guillotine on my sister. She wouldn't have seen it coming. She's blind. Was blind. I haven't got used to the tense. I confuse those still living with those past. What gets me through the evenings is drink. Ironic that, since drink is what killed her. I'm guessing it's unlikely you met her. We were close, I think, though I've no other sister to compare. Small, curly-haired, fond of a drink, she was, by the end, officially blind. A woman so bright that nothing got past her, could see only when the light was intense, which made every excursion a tense affair, for others as well as for her, her hand clutching your arm as you steered her past banana skins and cracks. But my sister was tough, didn't whinge about being blind, was cheery and stoical until drink took over, when all she'd want was more drink. Cheap wine mostly, not just to feel less tense, but to black out the knowledge she was blind, then fall asleep till nothing could stir her. There she'd be, out like a light, my poor kid sister, immune to her children, though she loved them past words, overwhelmed by a habit passed down through the genes. I too like a drink, you see. We've that in common, my sister and me, a weakness for booze. I make no pretence about it. In a way, I'm weaker than her, since I've no excuse. It's not like I'm blind and needing solace, whereas she went half blind when her kids were small. All that's in the past, and if ever I get angry and blame her for deserting us, I tell myself that drink gave her no choice. The need grew too intense, and night dropped its guillotine on my sister. Because of drink, she's in the wrong tense. I had a sister who was stoic and blind. Now she's passed, and I write poems for her. So it's different from the memoir somehow. I can't say how.
Yeah. The tone of this overall, I think, it feels very sort of forgiving of people's sort of, human frailties, and I think you say something about your dad, your mum, BT, Josie, Jill, all just trying to do their best. And there's also a sense of you having been, the first book, there was some kickback in terms of BT not being very happy, and Sam not being very happy. But there's a really nice sort of moment where you describe how Sam, in later years, ends up in running a caravan park, and he comes across this, or there's a sign there that sort of falls out of use, and it says Morrison on it, or Morrison, and he sends it to you, and that feels like a sort of, it's like an offering, or a kind of, there's forgiveness there as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether you ever read the book or knew about it. I mean, BT did.
Okay.
BT asked. Yeah, I mean, she got to read. I didn't tell her about it. That's wicked too, isn't it? But the book came out. I thought, I was a poet. No one read anything you publish. And I thought she'll never get to hear about this book, and she did. And she said, I'd like to see a copy, and then she wrote back, so I'm sending this back to you, this book. It's very upsetting what you said, and never arrived. And then she started calling and was friendly and loving and very close to my mum when my mum was ill in the last years, and and so she'd taken in the book, but I don't think she kept it from Josie, her daughter, and didn't come across it for 10 years, and I'm not sure she ever showed it to Sam. But you're right, I do feel, maybe it's just being older, you do feel kind of forgiving of the key players. You think about the lie to Josie about who her dad was, but you understand why. I mean, it seems very 50s kind of suppression of truth, and on the other hand, we know a lot of kids grow up not knowing who their dad is or being misled about that, and I thought in the end they were just doing their best about it between them, and even though it was a lie, there's no point being moralistic and condemning of it.
And in terms of your wickedness,
Yeah.
do you think that, you know, for people who are writing and wrestling with this stuff, do you think you, in a sense, maybe you have to be prepared that there might be a cost and people aren't necessarily always going to be happy, and that at some point you'll just, there's a calculation to be made about, you talking here about one of your intentions here is to show the devastation of alcoholism, and that felt like an important, you know, that's a reason.
Yeah.
And that we can't necessarily expect to write this kind of thing and then expect everyone to be fine with it and not cause upset.
No. Well, you think about Gillian and her book about her son's drug addiction, and I'm sure her motives were honourable, I swear, that, you know, she knew that skunk was causing lots of problems in families, and she recorded very honestly about her son changed his name, but she got crucified for it, really, you know, worst mother in Britain sort of stuff. And so there are consequences to candour. You do have to think about what people's reactions might be, but they're unpredictable. So it was going to sound very old-fashioned, this, that we had a housekeeper in our house who was there partly to answer the phone. Both my parents were working, messages for the doctor and all that, but she lived in the house. She was only 4 years older than me, and things developed between us that aren't supposed to happen with teenagers. And I wrote a little bit about that in the book about my dad, changing her name. She complained, why did you change my name? Like an IBB. And you know, your cousin tells you that the make of the car that you used was the wrong make, and somebody else complains that you portrayed his brother very unfairly, and yeah, you know, there are these things. I mean, they could happen if you're writing stories in fiction, and people think they can see through a disguise. I remember that conversation that you put in the novel. That was me, and you made that character horrible. I don't know whether you've ever had that sort of comeback, but shrug it off. But yeah, it happens, and it's just useful to be aware of it. And if you're doing life writing, yeah, particularly aware of it.
Yeah.
Well, one or two people I work with here are very conscious of it and thinking about wrestling with it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, or at least with fiction you can, you know, at least pretend.
Yeah. People see through the disguise there, don't they?
But you're right, people's reactions are very unpredictable,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Or maybe that is a good opportunity to, you know, for other people who might be wrestling with it, or who are not wrestling with it at all, but who might have questions, like people who have read or not read the book. How are we doing? I think that's plenty of time. Okay.
See you soon. No idea what to do.
Okay. I've got two proper questions, but quite a lot of things that I'd like to say. I found it really riveting. I'm going to put it down. Maybe that's partly because I know you. It's really peculiar, isn't it, reading something about someone you know. But I didn't know Blake when I read when you told me part, and I also didn't put that down either. But it's a really uncomfortable read and really sad. And there were times when I thought, well, how does this feel to be Wynne, for example, you know, who is quite critical of what he did, but he just left her to die over a long period of time, curled up by a radiator. That I found, so much of it was really sad and uncomfortable.
Just sorry to break into that. Yeah, that was hard for me too. He'd gone away for a few days, but the trouble was, you know, she would often get very, very drunk and fall asleep, and when he came back, she was asleep. And then overnight she died, or, you know, but he thought, like all the other times before, she was just sleeping. But yeah, it's uncomfortable, I agree.
And then on the bit about the cellar, that your sister was put in a cellar by your dad, because you're trying to tackle this question of, all the way through the book, you're sort of asking where did it all go wrong for Jill. And you didn't come across in the first book, or, you know, in And When Did You Last Hear a
Yeah, I think it happened. I don't know how long she was in there for. This was an attempt to get her to behave better. It wasn't to do with drinking, but anyway, yeah. I mean, yeah, I think my dad comes across much less well in this book.
Yes,
than
he
in
does.
the
So
first.
for those reasons, it's beautiful and moving and sad and riveting. But my questions are, I was describing it to a friend, and the friend said, "Oh, he's just writing that for his own end. He just gains from that, doesn't he?" And I was quite shocked. And said,
You get what from it, sorry?
And I said, "Well, in what way?"
Gains,
And I said, "What do you mean financially?" And the person said, "Well, financially, obviously, but also it's his job, isn't it? It's his profession, and he's lauded for it, for someone else's tragedy." So I wondered how you would respond to that. Obviously, that's not my opinion. But that's what somebody said to me.
Yeah, many years ago I wrote this poem called The Ballad of the Orchard Ripper about Peter Sutcliffe, and even before it came out, somebody spotted the mention of this coming out as a book in the catalogue, and they were disgusted that a poet would, make profit out of other people's misery. So I'm used to that charge, maybe. Yeah, you could say I did it for my own ends, because I wanted to make sense of Jill's life, and I wanted to make sense of what had gone wrong. To my mind, something had gone wrong, and there are various suggestions I make along the way of things that might have damaged her, including the fact that in those horrible times there was this horrible thing called the 11 plus, and I did it. We were only 16 months apart. I did it the year before her. I passed, she failed. Off she went to boarding school. My parents could afford it. They tried to encourage me to go. I stuck my heels in. I was allowed to stay home. She was banished or sent away. She might have had a good time at boarding school. She didn't. She had a miserable time. So that's the sort of thing where you think, yeah, you grow up together, you're very close, you have similar childhood experiences, and then I don't know the answer to your question, except that, I feel making sense of my family and how I grew up and these things is important, and I felt this was a subject worth exploring, particularly, as I mentioned before, the sibling relationship somehow doesn't get that much of a look in, and I got really interested in the research side of the book, was the fun side. You say the book's sad, there's some fun in it. And that's to do sometimes with looking at these, these famous brother-sister relationships, whether it's the Wordsworths or the Ackerleys or whoever it is. So yeah, I would defend it in that way. It's a book about the horizontal relationship, basically, instead of the vertical ones. The vertical ones, parent-child, account for far more memoirs.
Did you feel like in the process of you were trying to understand what went wrong, in a sense, what went wrong for Jill and for Josie, your half-sister as well, did the process of writing it, do you think you were able to make more sense of it? Do you feel now that you have got to more clarity? Or
I think so. I think, you start a book, I don't know about you, I start a book not knowing where it's going, because I don't know something and I want to find out. Not because I do know what the book is going to be, or what it's going to say, and where it's going to end. I don't know. So it is a process of discovery, and that's how the book's constructed, really, taking the reader along the same path, trying to find something out. So yeah, I think I was particularly Jill to understand her a bit better than I did. You had a question?
A different question now. Do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea to talk to sort of professionals, therapists, psychotherapists, about the subject? In other words, to seek not just sort of kind of bring us information about them, but also to speak to people who might not have known them, but do have theories about you.
Yeah, I mean, after my dad died, I had 6 weeks of seeing a therapist, and then I could imagine him saying, "God, spending that much money." So right write the book for therapy, you know.
Okay.
And I actually, many writers are down on writing as therapy, and I'm not really. I think it can serve that purpose for the writer, sometimes for the reader. There's an idea, one or two writers have felt, oh, I'll never go and see a counsellor or therapist because I'll lose my creative spark. I'll give it all to them when it should be going into the books. But I think there are lots of writers who do see counsellors and therapists and still write very well. So I don't think it prevents it. I mean, I didn't, for this book, talk to anybody, but I read a lot around alcoholism, blindness,
Yes,
brothers and sisters, and I think that's all a useful part of researching a book. And you do have to do research even in a family memoir, I think.
Through the writing of the book, did you feel your sister come closer to you? Did you feel like there was a kind of interaction that wasn't there in life?
Maybe a little closer. Of course, I thought, well, I wonder what she'd feel about this. Was she here in the room to react? And the most consoling thing was the friend of hers who said they had this conversation where Jill said, having written the other two memoirs, I wonder if he'll ever write about me. I wouldn't mind if he did, sort of thing was the gist of it.
I think I
And
might
I
like
thought,
it.
I might like it.
think
I
I might
thought,
like it.
yes, I have my permission. I can do it. That was great. I think she meant it. I think she was telling me just to make me feel better. Yeah. Sorry, there was another hand up there.
Just it's slightly similar, but just wondering. So you seem to write quite quick after the deaths, or a year after the book on your father. And I don't know when you started this, but your sister died 3 years ago, and so you're grieving as well. It's quite a big question, but I wonder how is there a negotiation that has to happen with that? Whether you give yourself a certain amount of time, or whether there are times whether you have to step away because you can feel that emotion there's too much of it and the write is getting lost, or is there?
Yeah, it's, I think it depends on the writer, it depends on the individual. Some people take the view it must take a long time. You get through the experience, you process it, and you don't begin to write till long after. And was it Bernice Rubens, the novelist, who said, you should write in yesterday's blood. You don't write immediately and on the spur of the moment. But I found writing about my dad in the 11 months after his death was, I was able to get things in that had I left it longer I would probably have thought better of, but would have been more distance from, and it gained from the immediacy of doing it fairly quickly. This took longer, but then I was also able to use old things I'd written down from many years back. So I think it's a matter for you. There's no right answer to that question. What do you think? I mean, I'm asking you, Tom, whether you think you need, take a long time, get distant from the thing you're attending to. I know you're a novelist and short story writer, but you've thought about memoir.
I just think, like, it depends on, the person and the situation as to whether it, that's a many years need to elapse before, you get to the right perspective. I think you have to feel like you want to write it at that particular time. I don't know if you can sort of make a judgment, general judgment about it, really. Yeah,
I think Lem Sissay wrote his memoir about, being in the care system, and 30 years after you've been through those experiences, and other people might do it 3 years later.
One of the things that did make me think, though, was the sort of the usefulness of having the material, in terms of the diary, that you were able to produce your diaries from way back. I was just like, these are the things that a memoirist needs in later years to be able to draw on. I mean, that's hugely useful, isn't it? To be able to, and the poem that you wrote for for your sister and husband when they got married, although I think maybe you never gave to them. But the fact that you had that,
That's true.
you're obviously archiving your...
Yeah, I don't do it all the time. I do it very rarely now. I rarely keep a diary now. But I used to, when I was very sad or upset or miserable. So I did have quite a lot of entries about my sister and the grief she was causing her, my parents, her kids, her husband, etc. Yeah, and I was able to use that, which otherwise would have been lost. I'd have forgotten all about it.
Yeah.
I wondered, if I, slightly different question, but when you first thought that you might write about your sister, and whether or not there was a part of it, whether that was part of the framing of your first book about your dad, because I remember feeling that she was quite absent in that book when I first read it, and I remember wondering why and whether or not there was a kind of consent issue then, you know, and so now I look back and I think I wonder whether or not that you were sort of half. I don't know whether or not it was already germinating as a separate story, or whether it was about protecting her and about consent at that point. So I was just wondering at the very beginning.
Yeah, no, I don't think there was a consent issue in my mind. I didn't think, I better not write about Jill. It was very much a father-son memoir, you know, my relationship with my father, and she just naturally played a smaller part in that. So it wasn't that I was holding it back, thinking, oh, I'll write about her one day, and you know, I won't give any of that stuff away now, because one day I'll write about her. I didn't. I was surprised to write the book about my dad. I certainly wouldn't have anticipated writing the other two. Did you ever ask a second question? I can't remember.
For me?
Yeah.
I did have a second question. I've got loads of questions. Yeah, my other question was, that this is a bit of a weird hypothetical thing because you would be dead. But if you could imagine it, how would you feel if somebody did the same thing about you?
Yeah, look, fair's fair, I think.
Yeah, you really have got no comeback.
I've got no comeback. I'm a serial offender, and you know, luckily none of my kids seem to want to write books, so discourage them very firmly from taking up writing careers. No, look, you know, I don't think there's anything to write about, but yeah, I couldn't honestly try and stop it, could I? As soon as I was coming across a reference in a book the other day to the phenomenon to which I belong, and many life writers belong in America. They're referred to as nobody memoirs. Nobody memoirs. I suppose as against to celebrity memoirs. So I've written 3 nobody memoirs. Because you're not famous. You're not writing as a famous person looking back on a career, or you're just writing about a slice of life, your life or somebody else's or whatever.
You're partly responsible for the nobody memoir sort of phenomena, aren't you? I mean,
I think it goes further back than me. But I think there are a lot more, aren't there, around, and it's been very big in the States. I think the rise of life writing memoir. And I think from 30 years ago, yeah, when my dad book came out, yeah, I think once upon a time, say in the 80s, that you had a story that was very autobiographical, and you gave it to the publisher, they'd say, yeah, but go away and make a novel about this. Boring memoir. No, turn it into a novel. And I think now they'd say, great, fine. This is.
They prefer it.
They might even prefer it.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, I've worked with people here who've written I thought, a really powerful memoir, and they haven't managed to publish it. And so I think it's as difficult for life writers as for writers of fiction. I don't think it's a very privileged form where it's easy to get a memoir published, but yeah, there's certainly more possibilities than there used to be.
Do you think the flavour of those memoirs has changed in terms of requiring a certain... I mean, your first book, and when Darcy book, maybe seems now relatively sort of undisclosing in terms
Yeah.
of, I mean, there's still a few details that kind of haunt me, but I won't, I think everyone knows what I'm talking about.
We'll talk about that afterwards.
Yeah. Whereas now, you know, there might be tendency to think that it really has to be the guts and
Yeah.
sort of, otherwise why are you doing it, sort of thing.
I think there's a bit of that. You know, a quiet book about grieving for a parent might struggle for readership. I've been plenty of them, but whereas, you know, extremities of abuse or whatever might find it easier. I think there have been such books in the past. I was thinking Julia Blackburn wrote a great book actually called The Three of Us about it was partly The Three of Us is her father, Thomas Blackburn, who was a poet, and her mother, but it was also that her mum used to take in these lodgers and they became her lovers. And her mum was terrified that one of these lovers would fancy the teenage Julia Blackburn, which duly happened. It's a book about a rivalry between them. But Thomas Blackburn had published a memoir in the 50s maybe, called A Clip of Steel. And the clip of steel was this little mechanical device that his father had sent him to the boarding school where Thomas was to discourage masturbation or erections. Because as you have got an erection, the clip of steel, well, I don't need to go into any more detail, but you know, that's a pretty extraordinary thing to be talking about in a memoir, isn't it? And that was the 50s. J.R. Ackley's memoirs, you know, about his love of his dogs, which isn't bestial exactly, but you know, some extraordinary details in there. So I don't think, you know, it's always been a tame genre that's now got sexed up necessarily.
We've got maybe time for one more question. What's in time?
It's like 3 minutes to.
How do you reconcile truth and perspective? Because you said about your family reading your piece and saying, well, it's the truth, so you're trying to publish. But then some people might be upset because it's always going to be your perspective of the situation. I don't know if you see what I mean, but those two things are not somehow in opposition.
No, you say, okay, you go and write your book then. If you see it differently, this is what I remember, this is my version of events, and I know yours might be different. But, you know, I'm trying to think of the famous case, Angela's Ashes, Frank McCourt. Two of the brothers, his brothers went on to write memoirs of one kind or another, you know, got that thing going in the family. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think a lot about my nephew Liam, my sister's younger child, and who's more reluctant to see how damaging his mum's alcoholism was. You know, he likes to remember in more straightforwardly affectionate ways, and I think he would be the one that struggled more with my book, even if he hasn't said as much to me. And you know, and what do you do about that? I mean, you say, well, mine's a brother's perspective. I'm sorry, I know you will see things differently, but I can only tell the truth my way. So yeah, if you're worried about somebody else's perspective in what you're writing, are you?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm with the twins. I'm writing about our relationship, and she's not too happy about it.
And have you thought of any solutions to this?
Not really.
I think that's what that's.
She is a twin, did you say?
Yeah, not identical.
No, but it's not easy to disguise the fact that she's
No.
a twin, even if you change her name.
Because I have changed her name and mine, but yeah.
Is it a novel then?
I'm not sure, but
No.
there's been a rift and there's a lot of opacity, I don't know how to pronounce the word, opacity, around what's going on, and I'm trying to kind of understand it through my writing. But perhaps one of the reasons why there has been a rift is has I've been writing without her, so
Yeah.
it's a bit of a conundrum.
It is very difficult. I always feel that you should treat Goldsmiths and working here as a private space. You're not putting it out in the public domain. You should not have that person looking over your shoulder while you're writing your drafts. That being published or being out there and shared by large numbers of people, not a discrete group. That maybe it becomes an issue at that point. But you should have a sort of freedom. To go your way. Now it's interesting that her reaction, and you could maybe accommodate that and assimilate that, but don't be inhibited. Yeah, just do it. I mean, I say to people, don't be inhibited by what, because in any case you can't always predict. But yeah, some people are very sensitive about being exposed, as if writing is necessarily aggressive. To put them in print, write about them. And that's the case in many families, and I'm sorry, but maybe you'll work it out.
Yeah.
I think we need to draw to a close. David is here from the bookshop to sell you books, please buy books. And
two, by the way.
sorry?
You've got 2 books to sell.
Two books?
Well, you've got,
Oh, you've got the parents as well. Excellent. And wine gets stuck in. And thanks very much, Blake.